Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this really important conversation on social protection, convened by Akina Mama Afrika and our great partners, Friedrich, Ebert, Stiftung. My name is Leah Erienyu. I'm the Research Advocacy and Movement Building Manager here at Akina Mama. We decided to have this conversation spurred on by the happenings or by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. It has always been a critical conversation, but what we've observed is that it's largely absent from public discourse, and it seems to be a conversation that is confined to NGO and development circles, or maybe some human rights circles. But if there is something that has shown the importance of social protection, it has actually been this pandemic. And every time you have a problem and you're hoping to see a silver lining, we hope that this crisis forces us to analyze and reassess our existing social protection mechanisms. It will encourage all of us to find out and understand deeply what social protection is, and give us the information and the courage to be able to hold everybody who's responsible accountable. So I'd like to welcome you all. And with those very short remarks, I'd like to call on Alana Kembabazi, who's going to steer this conversation and will help us know who the panelists are. Thank you so much, and you're all very welcome.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm actually trying to find. Good morning, everyone. It's tough staying a conversation where you can't really see who you're talking to beyond the panelists, but we are excited to be here. Like Leah said, my name is Alana Kembabazi. I work with the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights, and social protection has repeatedly come up. We've historically worked on the issue in a number of organizations, but we're beginning to see it come up in the national discourse, particularly as Leah has said, during a time of widespread, I don't want to say pain, but I think sometimes the only way to really, grapple with what so many people are dealing with on a daily right now. And we've had to re-examine what it means. What is Uganda doing? What is social protection? Social protection as a whole is broad, as we will hear, and refers to a whole sense of measures that are really supposed to cushion someone. You're supposed to be thinking about it throughout the life cycle. And it's a human rights imperative. The committees have tasked states to do so. We've seen it come through in the SDGs. We've heard about social protection, the SDGs. But it's also increasingly, as COVID has shown us, a national security imperative and a public health measure. People won't stay home, they won't comply if they are not able to get what to eat, if they're not able to think about healthcare. It redefines sort of how we envision the state, and should really reinforce the need for a strong social contract between the state and citizens. And failure to take it really does undermine a whole range of issues that pertain to the state. And so I'm very excited to moderate this discussion. Today we have quite a number of experienced panelists. First off, we'll start with a keynote speech from Ms. Irene Ukomu, who is a lawyer and civil spaces consultant. She's interested in strategies and communications in public policy, has a lot of experience in NGO management, and will be talking to us about the role of the welfare state, and is this a time for us to really re-examine that? Could I ask that whoever is not speaking right now to mute their mic? I keep hearing background noise. We'll also have Ms.
Hello.
Honorable Flavia, we can hear you, so great. You can now mute your microphone and we'll continue the conversation.
Yes, we'll have Ms. Lydia Nabirio, who is a Senior Program Officer of the Expanding Social Protection Program at the Ministry of Gender, Labour and Social Development. This is really the mother ministry that has
Hello, I can hear you. I can hear you.
Fantastic.
Are you hearing? Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Yeah.
We're glad you're able to join us. And next up, Honorable Flavia.
Yes, ma'am. I am here. How are you all? Are you fine?
Yes, we're good. We're good. And we will be calling
Yes.
up right now. Since you joined us a bit late, we've been introducing the subject.
Yes, yes.
Um,
Sorry, I got a problem with my device.
okay, we're so glad you could join us. She's
Yes,
the
please.
advocacy advisor of the Uganda Parliamentary Forum on Social Protection. She has been carrying a torch on issues of social protection for a really long time. I has spoken eloquently just last month at the NTV ISA Forum on Social Protection and has really been the voice from Parliament. So we're really excited to have her here. And then finally, but not least, we have Ms. Rebecca Sanyu, who is the Acting Executive Director of DRT, representing the Uganda Social Protection Platform. She's a Senior Social Policy and Human Development Specialist with a history working in the public policy industry. So in terms of the format, we're going to kindly request that if you're not speaking, you have your microphone on mute to avoid background noise. And we will give opportunity for people to have to actually ask questions of the panelists. But before that, but if you do have questions as they're coming in, I really encourage you to use the chat. As often happens in webinars, and I'm seeing already people using the chat, like, hi, Elliot, and a number of you who are sending greetings. It's great to see people already using the chat. Please definitely use the chat, give your views as we are talking, or if there are any other views you want to give, panelists will be able to respond directly from the chat, but will also be able to respond during the discussion. It just enables you to get an instant response, but also enables us to really collect ideas. Like Leah has said, this is a discussion that has been happening almost in silos, and the whole idea is really to continue these discussions that have been happening throughout this period, and to get everyone really talking about it and seeing what will demand from the state. So at this point, I would like to invite Ms. Irene Okomu to start off with her keynote address, following which I will ask the panelists to respond to it, but also ask them a number of questions before I then open up the floor. Irene, over to you.
Thank you, Ellen. Good morning, everyone. Let me just see if I can share my presentation. Right. Can you see that? Let us try to. All right, good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Perfect. So my presentation will focus on what a welfare state is, and from there, the panel will kind of contextualize that based on what Uganda has been building as a welfare state. So first, what is a welfare state? A welfare state is really a form of government in which the state protects and promotes the economic and social well-being of its citizens. And it's based on principles of equal opportunity, equitable distribution of income, and public responsibilities. And it's really focused on supporting citizens who are able to avail themselves of minimal provisions of a good life. Now, there are certain things that I've highlighted because in the distinction of what a welfare state is, there's a lot of contention about, A, what role should the state play? The model that's really practiced around the globe does not really support a big role of the state. And so that's one of the contentious issues. The second is really around the principles of equal opportunity, equal distribution of income, and public responsibility. Again, it comes down to the role of the state and focuses a lot on what the state should be doing and should the state be involved. Critics of the welfare state, of course, oppose this approach and say that the state should be playing a minimal role and it should not be in charge of distributing resources. The third area of contention is around how do you define a citizen who's unable? Because people who challenge the welfare state say, you know, there are a lot of people who end up taking advantage of the system. Lastly, what's a definition of what minimal provisions of a good life is? How do you define a good life? the way a good life is defined in Uganda, for example, is completely different from how a good life is defined in Norway or the US or in Latin America. So that's the big distinction for the welfare state. Now, the welfare state really focuses on supporting those who are underprivileged. And when you look at the components of the welfare state, it supports three categories of people. First is the elderly, and these are categories that people all agree that need some sort of support, or citizens who are in fact unable. So you have the elderly. In what ways does a welfare state support the elderly? This is largely around protecting those who have insufficient income later in life. So, you know, many older people have stopped working, and yet they find it difficult to maintain a certain standard of living once they've gotten out of productive life. The second category is children. The argument for the welfare state, or people who argue for a welfare state, is that children don't get to pick their parents. So a child doesn't get to pick if their parents will be rich or their parents will be poor. And so they shouldn't get punished for that. It's not their decision. And so in instances where children are not able to have a certain standard, a minimum standard of a good life, the state needs to come in and offer all children a certain minimum standard. An example of this is, for example, through free equitable education for all children, making that accessible. This is something that universally is agreed upon. The third area is really around the working age and the working population. And in this case, it's argued that the state should come in and be able to help people who are struggling, even though they are working age. This is usually where there are high levels of unemployment and it becomes hard for people to get jobs. And proponents of the welfare state say that anyone who works a full week should be out of poverty. Now, most in social protection understand that that's very different. There's a lot of people who do unpaid care work, for example, who do not get paid. But the argument is that if you work for at least 40 hours a week, you should be able to have, or should be out of poverty. So here proposals are things like introducing a minimum wage, for example, or introducing certain benefits that citizens can access. It's important to note that there's no country in the world that has achieved the ideal of what a welfare state should look like, but every citizen, what's agreed upon is that every citizen should have at least a basic income. They should have access to certain basic goods like food, medical aid, housing, and shelter. And so these are the basics of what a welfare state tries to provide. Now, the welfare state has grown and it's been around over years, but the modern version of the state really grew in popularity after World War II. After World War II, the world was really devastated. Statistics show that about 60 million people had died. And so you can imagine what that impact was like at that point. And so there was a lot of need for government to come and introduce increased spending on social sectors. There were a lot of orphans. There were a lot of people who were unemployed because economies had broken down. There were a lot of people who were disabled from the war, and there were a lot of broken families, and there was just no social safety net. And so governments had to come in. And this was after World War II. In the modern times, this was the most recent coming up of the welfare state. However, in the 1970s, the rise of neoliberalism started to come up. Now, what is neoliberalism? It is really what you call the means that markets control the economy. So rather than the government controlling the economy, the market should control the economy. A market is really the forces of demand, the forces of demand and supply. And so where there's demand, the market should be able to fill that in. And so the argument for neoliberalism is that government should play a smaller role and allow the private sector to be able to take over and fill in those needs. In the 1980s, this sort of was pushed by what they call the Regan Thatcher revolution. This was President Ronald Reagan in the US and Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the UK. And together they really pushed against the welfare state and pushed for the rise of neoliberalism. What does it look like? It looked like a revival of liberal policies, which meant that they aggressively promoted the rule of markets. So that meant downsizing the public sector. That meant reducing government spending on public goods and controls of the economy. That means deregulating the private sector and privatization of all public goods. Now, because these were the two largest economies at that time, this kind of spread around the world as well as the policy that should be taken economically. In Africa, this kind of came out and played out. What we remember the most is the structural adjustment programs. I think all of you remember this phase in the 1980s. Now, it was introduced by the IMF and the World Bank, whereby if African countries wanted to borrow money, they had to meet certain conditions, and these conditions were neoliberal conditions. The challenge at that point for Africa was that most of our countries had gotten unsustainable debt. We just were not able to pay our debt and were not able to sustain our economies. So we went through an aggressive restructuring. Many of you may remember that time in the 1980s, a lot of government workers were laid off. African governments, including Uganda, sold off all or a big majority of public assets. Whether banks, businesses, companies, so all of this was privatized. They liberalized the economy, which means that the central bank was playing a smaller role in regulating the economy. And so goods can come in much easier, goods go out. There've been different issues regarding the impact of all of this, but this is ideally what was promoted in Africa, so that they could increase competition, because the argument for neoliberalism is that the market will solve the issues. Now, as COVID and with instances where crisis comes, a lot of people realize that the market, in fact, is quite inefficient. And what neoliberalism has created is a situation where that the system, the cycle is so vicious that people on the fringes and the people who are most marginalized are not benefiting in any way from the market system. There is an argument now, and there's a revival of a debate that we do need more welfare states around the world. And this is coming out and being played out in different countries in different ways. One of the justifications is, one, there's a number of changes in the labor market. When you look at the way jobs are really changing. Because of globalization, we're looking at the nature of jobs changing. So globalization has introduced a process for things to move. And so it is promoting their interest based on what they can sell. Anything that can be moved is moved because you can make money out of it. For Africa, one of the biggest things we are selling is labor. And you can see that we have a lot of people moving to the Middle East looking for work. Anything that can be moved is being traded. So the nature of job is changing. We have a lot more contract workers. And so workers' unions are becoming weakening, and issues of protecting workers' rights are becoming deprioritized. So they're not as important because, again, the market. The other thing is that there's an increasing growing inequality. If you have looked at conversations around development, now the issue of inequality has come up a lot. The head of CEO, Winnie Byanyima, has constantly been pointing out how the top 1% make a lot more than the bottom, and that's something that needs to be addressed. Now, the market within neoliberalism cannot address that. Governments have to come in to address something like that. The issue of poverty. You see, the way private sector works is that they're not designed, business is not designed to solve poverty. Business is designed to make profit. And so the current model does not support addressing poverty in any way. And finally, is also the issue of urbanization, where social bonds are weakening, especially in Africa and Uganda. With urbanization, social bonds are weakening, families are becoming smaller, marriages are really not as important as they used to be. And so people are more individuals. So then what comes up where community solidarity is breaking down? What protections do you have if people are staying alone and are aging alone? What does a woman who retires and she's staying alone in a house do? So there's not a lot of that consideration being taken. There's also a collapse in unionization. Again, because of the nature of change of work, unions are collapsing. And so the power of the worker to be able to increase their value or to argue for better pay has really reduced, and it's become a challenge. Now, this has manifested in Africa and in Uganda specifically in a number of ways. And I'll just give some examples because I'm trying to contextualize the debate for what we're discussing today. Most African countries are still developing countries, Uganda as well. What this means is that in our pursuit for development, we're trying to copy different models, which means the model that's popular right now is the neoliberal model. And so we are all trying to copy it. I'm sure you've had conversations where we're trying to be like the Asian giants, you know, we're trying to copy that model of very fast, rapid, high economic growth. If you look at Uganda's Vision 2020, for example, our model is focused on increasing privatization, trade and investment, liberalizing the market and attracting investors so that we can create mass jobs and spur the economy. This is what most African countries are doing. That's the same model that's being applied pretty much the rest of the world. Second is that private investment capital are getting prioritized over human rights. You find that in Uganda and in a number of African countries, there's a lot of human rights that are getting sidelined with the focus of focusing on private investment. Whether you look at human rights, the environment, workers' rights, land rights, especially indigenous communities who are in areas where investment is trying to be implemented. Those are some of the worst affected because the priority is the investment. And in Uganda, you know, we've had so many instances over areas where people have been there's been mass displacement of people because a private investor must, you know, set up a business there. Because this is the model, this is what is prioritized. The third is that public interest is being redefined in the market. Now, how does this look like? Many of you have heard of what they call public-private partnerships. Now, what this means is the private sector is getting more and more involved in how the public is meant to lead certain crucial sectors. For example, in healthcare, in energy, in education, and even in security, we have more and more private sector coming into these areas through public-private partnerships. So that ISA, for example, has instituted a case around healthcare that was challenging a public-private cooperation to build a hospital. So that's just one example of how that's manifesting in Africa. And assets are getting accumulated in the hands of the rich. So you constantly see a lot of statistics showing that we are doing very fast. In Africa, East Africa, for example, is one of the fastest growing regions. We have high rates of growth. But when you go on the ground trying to translate that, it's hard for you to see how people are fitting from this development. Then when you look at it from an African level, the African Union is promoting a lot of free trade agreements and new economic agreements. There's been a trend in the last couple of years, if you've been observing at an Africa level, there's been so many summits. You know, the US-Africa Summit, the Russia-Africa Summit, the Canada-Africa Summit, India-Africa Summit, and everyone is trying to negotiate trade deals, economic agreements. When you look at the UK, most recently, I think just last month, the government announced that they're merging their office of DFID, so their foreign aid office, with their foreign diplomacy office. Again, all interests are about how does my country benefit, and that's changing because it's the market that's controlling a lot of this. So the focus is global markets and cheap inputs. Even African countries, as they sell themselves to the world, we try to focus on saying, you know, we have cheap labor here. When you look at our Investment Act, it focuses on giving tax holidays to investors. It prioritizes again the market so that it can build our capacity to grow. So where does the welfare state come in here? The welfare state comes in because it says, look, this model is not working. It's not working. And COVID is a great example of how the people at the bottom have been left out because of the market, because the market is not designed to be able to help the people who are on the fringes. And so the argument is that the governments really do need to step in certain areas. Now, the areas that people need governments to step in are about 5. One is, of course, retirement insurance. In Uganda, this is where the bill, the discussion around the NSSF bill is coming in. So, you know, can people access their pensions or not? because that's something that was created by the government. But that's just one component of what a welfare state can do in terms of offering social protection. Social protection also includes social insurance, health insurance. So can you make healthcare accessible to everyone? What does that look like? In the US, during Obama administration, they introduced Medicaid. And if you go to Kenya as well, the government has also introduced a national health care scheme so that everyone can be able to access care, regardless of their status or social status in life. There's the area of employment. There's how the country, those who are unemployed, what benefits can you offer to reduce the shock of losing an income suddenly? There's the area of disability. What are the disability benefits? And what can you do to help persons who are disabled to be able to manage or to have a minimum quality standard of life? And there's also the area of housing. Can you make housing more affordable? Because if you leave it to the market, housing becomes more competitive and becomes more expensive, and the poorest will not be able to afford housing, especially in instances of cities where you have the urban poor. Housing becomes such an important issue. So governments are best placed to solve these things because one, governments have the capacity that private sector doesn't. Private sector and markets are driven by profit, whereas governments, are largely driven by the interests of people. Two, governments these are long-term investments which governments they can accumulate the shock because governments can afford what's called cross-generational risk sharing. What that is that as an individual, I cannot make a contract with someone that will last 100 years. So I can't make a contract with my grandchild. Maybe I can, my great-grandchild, but governments can afford to do cross-generational risk sharing. An example is that a number of contracts and a number of loans that we took up as Uganda or different African countries as in the 80s are still being paid for right now. The government can afford that kind of loan because it's shared, that risk is shared across generations. That's not something that markets do. Finally, is that welfare practices today are less ideologically driven, and it's really driven by the need to help those who are struggling or at the bottom. So there's been a debate about, does Africa have a welfare state? And is it, do they exist? What models do we need to create? The truth is that Africa does have a welfare state or welfare models that it's implementing for social protection. Now, these may be a bit different from what are in other parts of the world, but there's a lot of welfare protection or a lot of welfare that's coming in for social protection. Now, I'm not going to get into how Africa is branded or what stratification there is, but there is a stratification of what social welfare or social protection looks like in Africa. I would say that the biggest distinction that they found is that in Africa, so with social protection, there's two aspects. There's social insurance and social assistance. Social insurance is really a sort of, it's a sort of assistance that comes in through a contribution. For example, SSF is a social assurance model. If you introduce medical insurance, is a social insurance model. So you contribute a minimum fee and you're able to get subsidized services. The social assistance means it's non-contributory. You don't need to pay any money, but you will still benefit. So for example, free education for all. If you say free education for all, that's a social assistance model. Although in Uganda with UPE, there's a small contribution that parents will pay. So that's social assistance. Again, so if there's no contribution on the part of the citizen, that's social assistance. The free food that the Uganda government has been giving out is social assistance. And so those are the two things. In Africa, you find that our trajectory is that we outspend all other regions on social assistance and not social insurance, which is why in Uganda, the discussion around social protection has been limited to the NSSF bill. But because that's the one big area in social insurance that we offer, but we outspend on social assistance. And that's because our countries, the way they are set up, like Uganda, the way we are set up is completely different from more developed countries. we have a bigger proportion of our population who are living under the poverty line. A second issue is that we have some of the highest rates of entrepreneurship. There's a lot of instability in entrepreneurship, and there's less contracts there. We also have a very large informal sector, so there's not a lot of people in formal employment. Social protection through insurance needs people that there's a contract with someone in employment and it's long-term, so that then you can design a protection model around them. You can design workers' rights, leave, child benefits around that. But in Uganda and in a lot of Africa, our economies are very, very informal. And so social protection has to be designed around that system. There's also a difference in demographics. About half the population here is under 15, so they're not working. They can't afford to make any contributions. Whereas in other places, a big proportion of their population is already working. So when we're discussing what does social protection look like in Uganda, we have to keep some of these in mind. So for the Global North, these are kind of the three areas that they focus on when looking at social protection and in terms of building their welfare systems. So public education, public health care, and the biggest section is income maintenance. So income maintenance looks at contributions either through, for example, if there's unemployment, so unemployment checks that they give, or unemployment funds, or for the elderly kind of giving certain income so that they have an income to be able to sustain their lives. Here, Africa, Uganda as well, you can see it's much, much broader because again of the nature of our populations, you have to do more than just giving people money. We have a lot of investment in emergency food aid. We have a lot of subsidized benefits that come in kind. We have public education, public health care. There's a lot of also social assistance and social assurance, and there's public employment programs. So it's a bit more diverse, again, because of the difference in the nature of our populations. That's very different. So it can't be just about cash transfer. So then how much should a country spend on social welfare? How do you define social protection for Uganda? Now we have a fantastic panel that's going to give examples of how Uganda is doing that and what can be done or changed. But each country really has to define or build its own system based on the needs of its population. In Uganda, there's a number of considerations that we have to take in. One is just the sheer size of our budgets, because when you're investing in social protection, you have to be aware of that. Two is the influence, again, of ideologies of the Global North. A lot of that influences how our own policies are designed and how our own assistance is also defined. And how much do you spend on welfare? So when we are going forward, a critical question I think for Uganda is, how do you then start to look at the informal sector? What protections can you offer the informal sector? How do you formalize the informal sector so that then you can offer some of these benefits that are more long-term for the sector? And then also just democratizing some of those and making them easier and more accessible for all of the population. So thank you everyone for listening to me, and that just kind of gives us a brief introduction into what social protection through a welfare system looks like.
I had stayed muted. I apologize. I was saying thank you, Irene, for that interesting discussion that I think sparks off a lot of, or will spark off definitely a lot of debate. I remember following the discussion on social protection and state of the nation and pushing for it. Someone came to Twitter to rant how we're socialists and we're pushing back for the welfare state, like it was a negative thing. So it's been very interesting to hear that. I am going to be opening it up to float the panelists, but before that, I actually just have two questions for you, because one of the things you did point out was that one, we must be really cautious about our budgets. And I'm wondering whether given the discussions, it's often very easy for people to say social protection, from a rights perspective, for example, people say progressive realization. Others will say, we just have to get to it eventually, but, we have limited budgets. And I want to really interrogate whether we don't have the money for that, particularly because, like you pointed out, social protection is a multifaceted thing, cutting across from health to education to things like, cash transfers, right? So we need to really interrogate that. The second one was that there would have to be formalization of the informal sector. And I'm wondering whether or not there has to be formalization of the informal sector, or you could meet the informal sector where they are and provide social protection. I don't know if you want to answer now, or if you do, or if you want to sort of hold on to these questions and hear from the rest and hear the questions. But I thought those two were key things. I know that came through very strongly in your discussion that needed to be clarified.
Yeah, so very quickly, I think that, if you're focusing on insurance or social insurance, you do need to formalize other sectors. The Uganda and Africa, mostly we are very agrarian. So that means we depend on agriculture a lot. We are not necessarily industrialized. The welfare state was developed when it was coming up, was developed in countries that were very industrialized. So people were employed, they had jobs. You could count the number of jobs that were there. So we're very different. And when you look at the I didn't want to get into the details of what Uganda offers because the panel will get into that. When you look at what the Uganda government offers in terms of social protection, it's very responsive to what the country looks like. So outside of NSSF, there's a lot. When you look at the government response to COVID, regardless of whether you think it's been enough or not, the response has been focused on social assistance, whether it is in offering food, whether it is saying, okay, children cannot learn, can we offer radio so they can get educational content? So it's been more emergency, it's been more focused on the populations. Even before, when you look at a lot of the social projects or programs that government has run, either for youth skilling, either for women or even for the elderly, again, it's more focused on social assistance, which means it responds to the type of country that we are. And so then it would be good to say, okay, is that enough? Is that enough to meet the shocks? And what more can the government do, just given the resources that it has? Yeah.
Okay. I think some of the discussions, particularly in the Uganda context, like agriculture insurance, like issues a bit about getting the informal sector, might be a better place for another panelist. So I will turn at this point to Lydia. And Lydia, you've had Irene's discussion around the need for a welfare state. You are our government person, the buck falls on you. Just talk to us a bit about social protection. I think there are still a number of people on this call that might not have a clear idea of what it is. The prior presentation was broader in terms of focusing on a welfare state, but talk to us about social protection and its context in Uganda. Give us a sense of what is happening in this space. What are the existing social protection programs? And what is working, what could be done better, and just sort of in light of COVID particularly, what recommendations you have for us.
Thank you, Malana, and thank you, Leah, for setting us off, and Irene for the introduction. I'll request to share my presentation. So I'm just taking you through our presentation. I'll try to run through it, but first give you the policy context, how we define social protection in Uganda, a bit about vulnerability, the programs that we have as of now, how they were deployed during the COVID pandemic, what has worked, what could have been done better, and then finally recommendations. So in view of the policy context, every policy that has to be made in Uganda has to be fitting within the broader national policy and planning framework. So social protection policy fits within the provisions of the Constitution, though not very specific. The Vision 2040, which clearly looks at universal pension for every citizen above the age of 65, social protection systems for orphan children, the disabled, the destitute, vulnerable youth, the able-bodied that can be channeled through public works. And then the NDP2 is looking at increasing the number of vulnerable persons that access social protection and gradual rollout of an annual contributory social pension for older persons. Within the social protection policy, which I will go into details, we are looking at comprehensive social protection, both contributory social security for both formal and informal sectors, but also expanding direct income support for vulnerable children, youth, women, persons with disabilities, and then older persons. So for NDP3, we are really contributing to Human Capital Development Program, which is focusing on reducing vulnerability and gender inequality along the life cycle. So that's where social protection is fitting within NDP3. To just summarize that there are many sources of vulnerability. Irene has in a way talked about them as she explained. We are looking at the social vulnerabilities that are associated with the life cycle and individual capacity. How are people able to manage negative aspects like loss of a job, loss of a breadwinner? We have the vulnerabilities that are associated with external risk and shocks. And here we are looking at natural disasters, violent conflict, climate change, the market trends, currency devaluation, epidemics, a pandemic just like we have had COVID, which is really massively affecting a group of people, not an individual. And then social exclusion, which is really leaving people out, some members of the society being left out. I won't get into the details of this, but it's showing that Ugandans face a number of risks across the life cycle, right from early childhood. And here we even begin with pregnancy, that a woman who is pregnant, if she doesn't get enough care, she can have effects on the child that is yet to be born. All those are risks that are around a human being, right from early childhood. When someone is going to school, aspects of child labor that we keep grappling with as a nation. The youth are struggling with inadequate skills and employment. The working age are struggling with unemployment, underemployment, gender discrimination. Old age, we really have a lot of issues to do with no care from the family, elder abuse, the challenge of becoming frail. So all these, but we also note that because the traditional forms of care and support are broken down because of the market expansion, the new forms of labor, migration, all these pose a lot of challenges on vulnerabilities that Ugandans face. And of course, the implication here is because people are exposed to a number of risks, low incomes, this deprive of their potential to build human capital. And that's what we are focusing on at the country. But also, it takes away the structural constraints to investment, such as insufficient access to finance, poor infrastructure, limited availability of skilled workers, and then high poverty rates and inequality, which Irene has talked about, hinder economic progress. And if we are increasing investment in social sectors, which is insufficient as of now, we'll not be able to do much unless we are extending social protection coverage and improving the adequacy of the interventions. So getting policy, we had a policy that was approved by Cabinet on 4th November 2015. We launched it in 2016. It is the National Social Protection Policy. It has a program plan of interventions, which is the action plan to implement it. For it is 5 years. The policy was for 10 years. So we hope to review it in 2024, which is not far away from now. In that policy, we define social protection. Like Irina said, every country defines social protection in its own context. So through consultations, we agreed that in Uganda, social protection means public and private interventions to address risks and vulnerabilities that expose individuals to income insecurity and social deprivation, leading to undignified lives. So we are really focusing on interventions by government and by private sector individuals, as long as they address vulnerabilities that expose individuals to income insecurity and social deprivation, then there are social protection interventions. We have two pillars, and the first pillar is social security, and the second is social care and support services. Within social security, we are looking at protective and preventive interventions to mitigate factors that lead to income shocks and affect consumption. So here we have two components: direct income support, which is looking at the non-contributory, regular, predictable, cash, and in-kind transfers that provide relief from deprivation to the most vulnerable groups in society. So the example that we have is the Senior Citizens Grant. Many people know it as SAGE. SAGE stands for Social Assistance Grants for Empowerment. So this is targeting older persons. And then a disability grant, public works. Then the other component is social insurance, which is looking at contributory risk pooling arrangements to mitigate livelihood risks and shocks arising from ill health, retirement, disability. So the example we have here is public service pension scheme, the National Social Security Fund, health insurance, informal self-help schemes. Then the social care aspect is looking at a range of services that provide for care, that provide for protection and empowerment to vulnerable individuals who are unable to fully care for themselves. So the examples that we have include the resettlement of abandoned and street children, the care and protection of children in conflict with the law. These are the ones that have alleged to have committed offenses. The institutional support to vulnerable children. Examples are the ones that are in remand homes, reception centers, institutional support for people with disabilities who are in centers, rehabilitation centers for people with disabilities, like the one we have in Reza and Chireka, among others, and then older persons. And then we have care and support to gender-based violence victims and survivors. And then community-based rehabilitation for people with disabilities. So this is the support for the people with disabilities, but in their communities. And then community-based care and support for older persons. That is just a summary, like the policy in a snapshot. We have our vision in the center. That yellow balloon is the secure and resilient families. That's what we would want to see. On the sides are the two pillars: social security and social care and support services, direct income support.
Yeah, I'm sorry, people want me to project the presentation, which I just realized. So if you're saying on the right or on the left, if there's a presentation you have, please project
is what?
it.
It's not projected.
It's not projected, unfortunately. Oh. I just realized as well because I kept saying, okay, and then I was trying to check. I apologize. Look at it. So before you explain what's on the right or left, please let's make sure we project that.
Fine. I have.
Just share your screen with us.
Okay, is that fine now?
Yes, now double click to make it full screen. Fantastic.
Okay, all right, thanks. So I'd gone through this, and so sorry about that.
Maybe you share.
Yeah, we'll share later. That's what I wanted. It's good you let me know at this point. That's what I wanted to see, because that's the policy at a snapshot. Just in summary, we want to see secure and resilient families. And in order for us to do that, we need our two pillars, social security and social care and support services. For social security, we have the direct income support, which is non-contributory. And then social insurance, which is contributory. And then on the other hand is social care and support services, which is really focusing on child protection, care of vulnerable groups, protection against violence. But we acknowledge that we need complementary interventions. And these include agriculture policies, the health policies, education policies, because we know that we cannot have secure families if our beneficiaries, even if we give them money, we know that our beneficiaries, example for Sage, they buy livestock. That livestock, or they want to plant crops. So we need the agricultural policies to be supportive, that when they get the money, they can put it to good use, and the agricultural policies should be favorable. The health policies should also be favorable, because when the beneficiaries get our money, they access health services. So we want to see the health policies working as well. Education policies, is clear that beneficiaries of cash transfers, once they get the money, they actually spend that money to support their grandchildren to attain education. So we contribute a lot. So those are complementary. We need the microeconomic policies functioning. COVID has shown us that we need those policies functioning to support the whole system, employment policies, as well as the financial services. So this is just a summary of the goal of the policy, which is to reduce poverty and socioeconomic inequalities for inclusive development by 2024. We hope to review the policy by then. We have 3 objectives. The first one being increasing access to social security. As Irene was presenting, you already noted that social security coverage is low. So we hope to increase it. That is what the policy looks at, by expanding coverage and scope for both formal and informal sectors, undertaking reforms, because we know, for instance, NSSF is a provident fund, and other products would require to be developed in order to offer social security in its whole context. Expanding direct income support, enhancing access to health insurance, compensation of workers, and then under enhanced care, protection and support to vulnerable, we are really looking at promoting community-based response mechanisms, as well as expanding scope and coverage of the support. Because we know very well that in most cases, people understand the support which is given to people, especially by civil society. When a person is given a blanket, that's clear. But we have challenges of people that have mental disabilities, and people look at it as a health service. But whereas you'll give medical care to the person that has a mental disability, this person needs personal care. Because many times we see them walking on the street, and people don't even care what would happen to them. So we need to ensure that services are clear, and then strengthening institutional support for framework for the social protection service delivery. This is about coordination and monitoring and evaluation, developing an MIS, because management information system will help us to see where the services are and where the gaps are to enable scale up. We have 7 priority areas of focus, which is public service pension scheme, reforming it, expanding social security in private sector to include provision for pensions, developing appropriate social security products for the informal sector because they are unique. Irene is recommending formalizing them, but we know that even with the informal sector, the way it is, we can develop products that can work for them, and they've actually shared with us some of the things that can work for them and which they're already working with. Introducing affordable health insurance, expanding access to direct income support for other vulnerable groups. Right now, we only have cash transfer to older persons, but we know that other groups are also in need. and then strengthening family and community capacity to provide care for groups that need care, and then institutional capacity. In terms of coverage, these are some of the figures that we have for public service pension. We only have about 388 people. This is nationwide by government. NSSF has about 1,840,000 people. The active ones are about 830. The active ones are the ones that actually contribute on a regular basis. The number is for anyone who wants to register. So there are more people that are willing to register, but the ones that meet and contribute monthly are few. In terms of voluntary occupational schemes, we have about 43,000 people, 148. And the informal social security, we have about 7,295. These are the people that are from the two schemes that we have currently under informal sector, the Mazima retirement scheme and Kasita. So they are few, but they are being encouraged to make contributions. Those are largely private sources of funds. In terms of rehabilitation services for children, people with disabilities, we have them in certain centers across the country, not necessarily in every district. The remand homes are also in some districts. Services for victims of gender-based violence. We have about 3,000 that were supported in shelters that are around the country, which are about 11 in a few districts. They are government and supported by civil society or private sector with development partner support. The OVC that were able to be reached were 114, 448 in various areas. So we are looking at these ones that were able to get at least one-time support. So how are the programs deployed? Here we are really looking at the Senior Citizens Grant, which is the cash transfer to older persons who are 60, for 8 years now as we roll out. At the pilot, we started with 65 years and 60 years for Karamoja. Right now we are rolling out to 80 years and above. So at least the decision to have the rollout nationally has been made. Right now payments have been are ongoing. They've been paid for 6 months. And then government has provided for next financial year 107 billion to support the Senior Citizens Grant. Government is also providing 130 billion to support temporary employment for those that lost jobs due to COVID, and also expanding coverage in urban centers and flood affected areas, targeting the informal sector workers who lost their employment. Disaster risk financing mechanism was triggered, and this one helps us to see where the dangers are and what needs to be undertaken to intervene before the situation gets out of hand. And government was able to provide food aid distribution in urban centers, but also we realized that many other development partners came in to support distribution across the country. This is just some funding for the Senior Citizens Grant. Government committed 149 billion for 5 years. And from 2014, when government first provided funds, 2 billion, we are now moving to 107 billion. By 2029, we had 63 billion. So the figures, the chart reflects the 63 billion. But right now, we have increased funding of 17 billion for the national rollout. What has worked? The delivery of the payments to older persons under siege. Several NGOs and humanitarian organizations have been able to provide social protection cash transfers. The Ministry of Health has come up with comprehensive social protection response plan. I mean COVID response plan that includes social protection as a pillar. So recognizing the role of social protection in addressing the pandemic. Government national coordination system to respond to COVID challenge is in place. And then we've had joint gender-based violence prevention and response by government and other development partners and civil society actors. What could be done better? We could be able to implement the policy the way it has been designed, as I earlier shared, is wide, just that we are implementing in a phased manner, but if the funding would be available and we consolidate it, we could be able to reach out to more groups like children, people with disabilities, and then expanding the labor-intensive public works. These are the ones that are implemented under Northern Uganda Social Action Fund, where people identified as having ability to work will work on a community asset like a drainage. In Bududa, for instance, they work on managing the water runoff by having trenches and grass and tree planting to manage those shocks, but also they are paid cash to meet their basic needs while they maintain the environment and also build the community assets. Labor market regulation, being able to restrict layoff of workers by private companies, which really makes people more vulnerable. Tax waiver for low-income earners, and then unemployment benefits for those that have lost jobs. And GBV prevention, of course, we know that something has been done, but we see repeatedly a number of cases going on. We can improve on that, disability-friendly and child-responsive interventions. And then increasing the expenditure on social protection, because it's still low, stands at about 1.82%. We're also looking at implementing social responsive social protection system, which is really looking at expanding the duration of the benefit, expanding more people to be reached, delivering on the already existing programs that we can scale up, and reprioritizing resources to ensure that the new shocks are addressed. What are we recommending? Implementing the policy as a foundation for building the system, developing the shock responsive strategy, firm role of government in coordinating service delivery, as it did during this COVID response, lowering the age of the senior citizens grant beneficiaries to all older persons, 65 years and above, and then designing and implementing disability grant to support people with severe disabilities, establishing and funding a disaster risk fund to cater for times of massive shocks, just like COVID, and then fast tracking the enactment of the National Health Insurance Bill. It will help us to address health shocks. And we are looking at contributing for the people that are indigent and can't afford. So we are working on the actual figures to be able to have subsidies for such people. And then fast tracking the development of the single registry with clear data from NIRA and NITA, because we know there are challenges there. And then for private sector, we are recommending working collaboratively with government to avoid duplication and to ensure that the underdeserved areas are reached. We realize that many times every NGO wants to work in Kampala and they don't want to go up country. So I think that we are able to reach the areas that nobody wants to go to. We shouldn't also be, as development workers, working towards exclusion of the most disadvantaged. We need to look at inclusive development and inclusive support, and then contributing to the government social protection agenda. For private sector, I know their business is profit making, but we are recommending that they implement the corporate social responsibility and support social protection interventions for the vulnerable. So as I conclude, social protection is important as a strategy for building resilience and addressing shocks, such as COVID and the floods. And if we develop and implement comprehensive interventions following the life cycle approach, we'll be able to help the country withstand the effects of shocks. And we'll also be able to facilitate human capital development and contribute to equitable growth and socio-economic transformation. Synergy building among the state and non-state actors is important for strengthening the impacts, cost effectiveness, and enhancing sustainability, thus maximizing outcomes. So So thank you. Over to you, Alana.
Thank you, Lydia, for that really great presentation, especially when we could see it, because we got to see some of what has been discussed, the different programs in Uganda. There's been a discussion I see happening on the chart, whether education is a part of social protection, because the policy left things I didn't consider EPE, for example, directly tangentially within social protection, and sort of the discussion of what that looks like. Before we hear about the next panelists, you did make a number of recommendations. I noticed there is none around the legal framework. You have a policy, then you have social protection scattered here and there in the objectives in the Constitution, and even then they don't really use the words, social protection. So for the lawyers, we like to it's like we are, I don't know, weaving something, get a thread here, get a thread here. Just curious about your thoughts about that. But also when you're talking about social protection, to what extent do you feel the government has focused on social security more than social protection? Because like you say, social protection is a holistic set of measures throughout the life cycle. I know at the African Commission, this issue around is social protection more than social security really came to the forefront as they were drafting the protocol, the Charter on Social Protection. And states often say, well, no, then we'll throw everything in. So how you define those parameters as government? The third question really that we would love to hear, we've heard a lot about what government is doing, but we know that equity and non-discrimination are really core when thinking about social protection. If you could just speak a bit about that as well. Lydia, I think she's frozen. Hello? We may have lost Lydia. As she joins, I'm wondering, maybe she'll answer the question later, or maybe we can just move the next panelist because we seem to have lost her for a bit. Yeah, we definitely have lost her. Webinar is always fun. I would like to hear from the next panelist, who is, I think we should move to Sanyu, to Rebecca right now. Rebecca, having heard what government has spoken about, what are some of your thoughts? Hello? Great.
Hello.
Hello, you can hear me? Great, yeah. So
Yes.
maybe talk a bit about some of the work you do, but also like having had the two panelists talk about the need for a welfare state in different ways. We've talked about just sort of the broader landscape and painted the landscape of how this discussion on social protection happened internationally. Then we've heard about what Uganda is doing. As the term as private sector from the civil side, from the other end of things, what are some of your thoughts? Do you think we are doing enough? What do you think we should be really focusing on? And what are the lessons you've learned in terms of the crisis and shaping this discussion around social protection?
Well, first of all, I would like to thank the panelists, Irene and Lydia, for the discussion they've had and for opening our understanding to this subject. Now, when I think about social protection in response to COVID, because that was the topic, and so that would be basically discussing what we would call shock responsive social protection. So I ask myself the extent to which the social protection system in Uganda is able to respond to shocks as we define them. But first of all, I would like to say that sometimes we might have a narrow view of what shocks are. Usually when we talk of shocks, we might think of disaster risk issues, maybe humanitarian issues, major stuff, because I have not had previously a situation like Ebola, a situation like maybe cholera, treated as a shock that might warrant a discussion on social protection like we are having during COVID. And in fact, that is also an eye-opener, because suddenly we have a situation that is initially considered as a health issue that would have been treated the way Ebola was, you know, purely from a medical perspective. And then it is affecting so many other aspects of life. And suddenly we realize that social protection is important. So I think that's, for me, a very important thing to highlight. So in discussing the ability of our social protection to respond to shock, I think we need to interrogate the improvements that government and agencies are attempting to do, or those that they ought to attempt in case they haven't. So some of the questions I've been asking myself, for example, is if you think about all the social protection programs and interventions that Lydia has talked about, the Senior Citizens Grant, the NSSF, the Public Works, the government pension, the NUSAF, health insurance if we have it, and the social care and support services. To what extent have they been able to meet the needs of the population during COVID? That's one of the things that we need to ask. The interventions that have been attempted, how many people were affected? First of all, did we know how many people were affected? And to what extent have we been able to cover the affected people using our social protection system? And then the question of timeliness. The social protection interventions that have been provided, when you think about maybe the food provisions, the Senior Citizens Grant, have they been timely? Because for a social protection intervention to be shock responsive, it needs to be able to respond in time. For example, when we got the food, did we get it when we needed it? When the Senior Citizens Grant is being issued, is it being issued at a time when it was critically needed to address the COVID-19 related income deficits or shocks? So those are the questions that we need to ask, even for others. Did NSSF even attempt at all, if it's a social protection program? And of course, there are questions about whether NSSF itself can be, we can continue to refer to it as a social protection program, but maybe that's a discussion for another time. So, and to what extent, for example, can we create modifications within the social protection system or program that we have to be able to respond when a shock comes, when people are affected by floods, when people maybe have a famine? To what extent can we be able to say that the guidelines are modified to be able to reach people quickly as possible? So that would be timeliness. And then of course the issues of predictability. Now, given that we are responding during a period of shock, one might wonder whether it needs to be predictable at all, whether a social protection program needs to be predictable for shock responsiveness. I would say that predictability can connote either of two things, given the situation you're responding to. On the one hand, it connotes the regularity of the social protection provisions. If people are receiving a cash transfer, for instance, is it regular? Does it come when they need it, you know, at a specific time when they expect it? But on the other hand, it can refer to what is embedded in the legal, policy, and institutional framework that can quickly be evoked to ensure that those who are in need can receive the assistance they need. So we need to ask ourselves, is our social protection system flexible enough to say yes to each of those questions that we are talking about in this case. I wouldn't want to say yes or no because the results are varied. It really depends. So maybe the other question you asked was whether, in my view, government's response during COVID-19 has been adequate. I would say that at the outset, there seemed to be an upbeat mood. People were excited about, responding in time, being able to do what needed to be done. And I think, yes, the will is there, especially on both the side of the technocrats and the politicians. But I would say that because of the upbeat mood, because of the need and the realization that we really needed now to change from the usual social protection provisioning to transform it into a shock responsive social protection at this point in time. So there were some ideas and proposals that were made. Some of them were about how they would deliver the senior citizens grant, for example, quickly at that time, maybe even pay in advance so that in case we have an extended lockdown and people wouldn't be able to access maybe the pay points, they would have got their money in advance. So such things were discussed. There were proposals of a direct income support for persons with disabilities, especially those that depended on others for daily living. There were proposals for children aged 2 years and below to receive an income transfer, a universal transfer for all those children aged 2 and below, regardless of whether they were coming from rich households or poor households. And then there were suggestions about giving informal sector workers a monthly income for at least 3 months. So these discussions were held. It's not as if government was not trying to do anything. And when I say government in this case, I especially refer to Ministry of Gender that hosts the Social Protection Secretariat, but also development partners and some actors in civil society, and also Ministry of Finance. So these discussions happened. Now, whether this came to fruition or not, maybe is what we need to interrogate. If all these discussions happened, why is it that the public doesn't seem to have seen anything happening? So what the public was able to see was the food distribution to apparently informal sector workers who depend on a daily income. And then there were loan holidays to business communities. And I remember the Minister of Finance saying this would only be given to good borrowers. So then the question also becomes, was this really social protection? In my view, the food distribution was more of a humanitarian response, disaster risk response, really. And not so because food distributions cannot be social protection, but the way it was handled, I think, was more from that perspective. And so I would say that the efforts were there, some interventions were done, but in my view, they fell short of the requirements for what would have been defined as a social responsive social protection. The reasons for my view are the opportunity, for example, for the senior citizens grant to be delivered in a shock responsive manner was lost in many ways due to delays by both the bureaucracy and the lockdown measures. So there were questions about how do we go in, can we bring in, can we ask people to come, can we use mobile telephones, but people are not registered on. So basically the design itself had challenges that sort of undermined the ability to respond immediately, even if the resources were available, even if the willingness and the staff were willing and able to go in and provide the senior citizens grant. There were design issues that undermined some of the effort that they had. And then in other instances, government lacked own resources to implement, for example, the grant to 2-year-olds and below, the grant to the direct income support to people with disabilities, and also informal sector workers. If they were to be given a cash stipend, for example, a food stipend, the government lacked own resources, so they needed development partner support. Now, obviously, they were in discussions with development partners, but then at some point, there were concerns about the possibilities of duplicating resources. If one set of development partners, for example, was considering giving money for maybe children and another set for people with disabilities, and of course the one for older persons is already guaranteed, and then we have another development partner providing money and saying it would be for maybe also those kinds of categories. So then the question became, do we go into give this facility, this grant, or we don't? So those hesitations happened, and at the end of that day, I would say they happened at the time when also the technocrats and the politicians now had to negotiate how to use the money. And in some ways, in my view, the political decisions overruled what would have been very good, technocratic decisions. And so maybe that's also a point that can be discussed. How politics plays a part in the provisioning of social protection, and whether politics is always for against us, or to what extent does the politics support the social protection sector. So in my view, the best that some of the categories like women, persons with disabilities, other marginalized groups, the best they got were very well written standard operating procedures of what to do and what not to do. The senior citizens grant eventually took off, but like I said, it didn't meet the criteria of timeliness. Yes, the lockdown is on, but basically much of it has been lifted. So teams were able to go out and deliver the grants. I think one of the things that Lydia mentioned was the central registry that we really need to think about as government and other non-government actors, working together. If, for example, I keep wondering if the central registry was linked very well to the mobile telephone system, maybe the disbursements of these grants would have been quicker. But also, it's not only on the part of government, on the part of the citizens. To what extent do we want to comply with what government says? For example, when it says, go and register your mobile phone. Make sure you have a national ID, because some of those things are what delayed the process, or what will continue to delay the process, where shock responsive social protection would have to basically to be provided. Yeah, I think for now that's the discussion I would have. I may not have provided answers as such, but really questions, the things that we need to ask ourselves, what is it that government needs to do better, and why is it that government wasn't able to, to respond the way it had intended to do. Yeah, over to you for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And you have a couple of questions, but I'm also realizing you're quite short of time. But thank you for highlighting again that you've talked about the context, and you say from a citizen's perspective, it just hasn't translated. And I want to turn to Honorable Flavia to really reflect on this. Why is it not translated? One of the reasons people would pause it would be budget. financing. So looking at the financing, you know, are we really making progress? And what could be the low-hanging fruits for social protection, right? But generally, just having, in terms of having a reflection of something that could translate to citizens on the ground right now, but also challenge you to reflect on how we really move from having an aspiration of social protection. Something that works for citizens. What are some of the things that we need to do? One of the things that you pointed out as well was the lack of political will. So you have a background, you've been a member of parliament, and you engage with that. So how do we generate political will for what we think is a very critical thing to address right now? Hello? Hello, and as I wait for Honorable Flavia to join us, she's been having trouble with her internet. I see a question here from, I believe, from Blair. I see it's Akina Mama. But what would have been an appropriate social protection response for women who are required to sleep in the market? Could the government have done better for women who are essentially rendered homeless? Honorable Flavia, are you back? Hello? If it's a video that is causing issues, you could just hide the screen. And maybe as I wait for Honorable Flavia as well, Rebecca, I was actually curious about citizens, because you talked about all the sort of different stakeholders, but why citizens are not articulating these demands in the ways that they should, in the ways that will generate the political will, because political will, because leaders want to be in power, they will sway to what will make it costly for them in terms of the will is the election if we don't fix it. So I'll be curious to hear about the citizens' role in that, their participation, but beyond participation, their involvement in articulating social protection as a demand on the national agenda. Flavia, I think we have you back. Hello? Can you confirm if you're back? We may have lost her, but yeah, so Rebecca, if you could reflect on that before we have Honorable Flavia, and if people could prepare to ask questions, we'll then be turning to that.
All right. Well, previously, I would say previously, and a little bit currently, citizens are demanding, okay? They have demanded for various forms of social protection. The informal sector workers have demanded. The question is, are they being heard? Is the issue they are demanding for now equally important if you weighed the issues? And I think now we have competing priorities. The issue of responding to COVID from the Ministry of Health perspective, and the issue of providing social protection, for example, to informal sector workers, and the fact that maybe you have the same set of politicians and technocrats debating these issues and having to make decisions. So who do they give what they want? I mean, they have to be concessions, but there have been several processes where citizens have demanded. And now, one of the things, for example, that has happened is they have been using the available fora. There have been many Twitter, discussions and other online discussions about what needs to be done. I know that some civil society organizations have had fora, face-to-face fora with the World Bank and other development partners and even government to try and determine what can be done. I know that aging and disability organizations have interfaced with the Ministry of Gender, for example, to try and find out what could be done. Like I said, much of it has got into discussions and good recommendations, but it has not come to fruition. maybe some of it will, maybe some of it won't. There are things that are going to be difficult for government to do. For example, providing a stipend for the informal sector workers. Because the informal sector, if you look at it, it is large, it is varied. Many people argue that it is largely unregistered, but it is also registered if you consider the associations. For example, Market Women's Association, the Boda Boda Association, if you looked at those, you could be able to reach them, but how do you reach them? You know, what facility are you going, what sort of money are you going to give them? What sort of grant, for example? What is social protection that is appropriate for them at that point? And I see somebody here has written a question about, for example, market women. What sort of social protection would be appropriate for them? One of the things would have been if we had the social care and support pillar of the social protection policy well built. These women could have been provided with child care facilities, because to remove them from their children to stay in the market is creating another vulnerability for the children. So if at least there was a provision where they could take like a daycare center near their workplace, where they knew our children are safe, our children can see us, you know, that is also part of social protection. So we cannot exhaust some of these things, but there are many ways that you know, could be explored.
Okay, so it's a rather pessimistic view that the citizens are articulating, but it's not really translating. We'll get back to that. I see Honorable Flavia seems to be back. Honorable Flavia, can you please confirm we can hear you? You don't have to necessarily see if it's interrupting your connection. Hello? Okay, so I would like to take some questions as we wait to I see that some questions have already come up. I see some reflections. One from you know, from Eugene, who, for example, was a comment about really applauding you, Sanyu, for linking the idea of central registration with mobile money registration, which has been done in another country, and something USSP could also think about doing. Another one from Daphne asking whether youth are considered a vulnerable category. I think, Lydia, this might go to you. And what the social protection, what is government planning for young people who have lost their livelihood years ago? And then from Marianne, really just thinking about whether we need to be thinking about where we situate the social protection program and whether that influences its effectiveness. She asks whether one of the challenges might be that it sits within Ministry of Gender and Disaster Preparedness and therefore makes it more likely for it to focus on it as social assistance response rather than social protection. And what difference would it make if it was actually thought of as a social protection program? And then another one from Akina Mama saying, we started some of the discussions that Sanyu raised about the options that were being discussed by government and wondering why the public was not privy to some of these discussions. This as a caveat might depend on sort of where you work, but I do agree. And also how we can deliberately ensure that citizens are aware and are making demands beyond NSSF. I think I had read some of the others earlier on, but these are some of the things that are coming. I want to ask, Honorable Flavia, are you there? I wanted to ask that one of the things that she will also respond on when we do, when her connection stabilizes, is really around why it's not translating in practice, and budget is a critical aspect around that, who funds it, how they're funding it. But I also want to open up the floor for some questions. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. I believe there you can see the question, the hands that are raised. I may not be able to see it. I see another one from really, which is saying that she agrees with Rebecca that citizens are not, it's not a question of citizens not making demands, but they're being unheard, giving an example of GBV, gender-based violence shelters that people have been asking for a long time. Yeah, so if you want to ask your question, please raise your questions now. We will note the ones that will also be for Honorable Flavia, so when she joins us, she can respond to them. Are there any?
Alana, I was also thinking that because Honorable Flavia has been having problems the entire call, and we have about 20 minutes left, so it may not even be possible for her to connect successfully. So I was wondering if it's possible for the other panelists to tackle some of the questions that she was supposed to tackle, or even to just put it back to the public, and maybe I can just read those out. Let me see. Okay.
Yeah, before that, maybe just also, because for a number of panelists, they'll be speaking again, and we haven't heard from the broader group in case there are any questions as well. I think it'd be great. Those questions are all.
Oh yeah, Jennifer.
Raising their hand. Taka maybe.
Yeah, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you so much for the discussion on social protection. It's me, Jennifer, currently working with CSO Uganda.
Okay.
I think I really like the discussion in terms of elaborating the policy framework in terms of social protection in Uganda, which was elaborated done by Lydia, but also with the earlier presentation, giving us the global perspective. And I also like the fact that Sanyu, brings us into the context, in the COVID-19 era, how there's a misconception between what is implemented as said a food distribution to be thought as social protection, yet from the policy framework, not through the social protection. So I think going forward, my question is, what is the for Minister of Gender going to do, to ensure that the policy framework is operational? Because there are a lot of things that then need to be done, like, to ensure registration of citizens, across board, to know who are the vulnerable children, for instance, where they are, for us to be able to talk about a functional social security system. So in terms of what is the way forward, in terms of really operationalizing the framework, because we have the framework, we have the implementation plan, which was not even helpful, during this time of COVID-19. So how do we see them move us forward, in this respect? Thank you.
Okay, so I think there's a question mostly for Lydia, but all the panelists could reflect on it. Are there any other questions? David, sorry to call on you, but I did see that you had a question that was tangentially related to this, because Jennifer has talked about sort of widening the ambit of what we do in social protection to include things like food. I saw you had a comment there about the dangers of over widening the ambit. I don't know if you want to come in at this point. And I believe, David, you work with the expanding social protection program as well. I don't know if you have any other questions. Hello?
Oh, I can't see.
Well, maybe he's left. I think he had raised the question about if we call everything social protection, doesn't it make it easy for the government to say it's doing social protection? Because it will count everything.
Hello?
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 Yes.
Am I on now?
Yes.
You
speak because we may lose you again. We're taking questions. And
okay. Oh, all right. Now what do I do? Will I send my presentation?
Yeah, you can send your presentation. You can share the screen if you would like. Particularly now, and we had asked to think about why it's not translating into reality for citizens. Looking at the
I'm sorry, my internet was not so good. It kept getting on and on.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I listened into the other presentations, and I'm sorry I couldn't do my presentation. I had a number of issues to respond to those who presented. I thank you, Irene. I thank you, Lydia. I thank Rebecca, and Alana, thank you for moderating. Hello?
Hello, yes, thanks.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you really well. I would suggest you dive right in and give your thoughts, responding to the conversation, but also addressing the issue of financing for social protection.
Yeah, maybe when I draw in, let me just try to be brief. I'm looking at the time. And you know, the issue of this pandemic and what it has done to the country, putting us at a standstill and interrupting every business and distracting incomes and salaries and jobs and employment. I think in such an environment, people would look at their savings at the rescue without minding about even the terms on which they contributed or saved it. So the NSSF had to be the next solution for the people, even when that was not the purpose for which they had saved it. But what I've observed is that even the members saving with NSSF have always asked a number of questions. How is it calculated? Who qualifies for NSSF? How does it pay its members? How can I get my money from NSSF? And all those questions have.
We may have lost you. Hello?
Especially, and so it may lose the sense of being a social security, and in turn, it may even take a long process to establish how much is enough to relieve in shocks, because the savers don't have the same balances, and therefore 20% of their respective balances would not give uniform withdrawals. Because someone who has saved like 500 million, their 20% would be 100 million, and is that the one that will get them out of shock? And so, of course, it would cause even a sale of assets invested because of the premature withdrawals. So the fixed assets would be sold, and especially they would therefore be discounted for them to get the money out of it, and consequently, in whatever form this fund meets its liquidity requirements, it would affect the economy very severely. Because when you look at the total membership of 2.3 million out of the 16 million working population, and only 1.2 are the core members, and even out of the 1.2, 53% are the active ones, and 47 are dormant. 8% of the core members own 75% of the whole fund. So about 1 million active members, which is now 80%, have balances below 10 million, and only 7% have balances bigger than 50 million. So for me as a person, and we as Uganda Parliamentary Forum on Social Protection, we are saying the proposal may not address the wider needs for the relief, and yet it will leave irreparable damage on the fund. But the amendments to the Act, on the other hand, have an objective of providing for midterm access of voluntary benefits on such conditions that may be set by the board. I believe the Parliament will sort this out, because they have stayed with this out, and but the time is now that we should start talking and discussing and thinking about the other benefits and products like unemployment benefits, medical benefits, housing and education, because this could be the next advocacy strategy, so that we stop looking at NSSF. We even have more than 60 other retirement benefits registered, but their members are not as agitating as these of NSSF. And so we need to sit down and really look at the other products that from which people can benefit. But when I go to financing, I know Lydia has alluded to the fact that we have a number of projects and implementations on social protection in different areas. But me, what I realize is that the silocentric nature of operations in this country renders these funds inadequate, because all these programs are getting a not so bad amount of money, but the silocentric nature of our implementations and operations makes the funds inadequate. And this is even exacerbated by the inappropriate priorities and lack of accountability and value for money. So the national social protection policy needs to practically promote synergies and fast track the single registry, so that we can avoid duplication and wastage. Achieving this requires that the social protection policy implements the vision, the social protection, and also goes back to making it understandable to every government person, government officials, technical people, and all of us, the communities, the concept of social protection, so that all of us, the players, can speak the same language on understanding these social protection interventions. But the low-hanging fruits are very many. The low-hanging fruits are, one, I think cash transfers will automatically replace most of the incomes. This is very critical. And I want to thank the government for the budget speech, where they seemed now to be starting to talk about and discuss issues of protecting people out of poverty and vulnerabilities by thinking about the informal workers who have lost incomes, by thinking about the private sector, saloons and private schools teachers, and all those who lost incomes, by supporting them with money so that they can rise up. So this is a sure way and a very critical way with which we can raise up our people from their vulnerabilities. We can even drum up social security for all. We should use this particular period of the COVID pandemic to portray the importance of savings to the masses and encourage robust development of our social insurance systems and enhance community and traditional social protection interventions. You know, here in Africa systems had a traditional vulnerabilities. So we can capitalize on this and portray it to them that we need to come back to those roots and start taking social from as the first unit of intervention, so that everybody is involved in this social protection. We can also invest in social protection because it boosts the demand side of the economy. It bears very, very high returns, and it improves the human development and labor productivity. All evidence is around for all the interventions we have made. Just a single coin that you invest in social protection will pay almost 3 times as much. And so everybody should start looking at social protection not as just an expenditure, but an investment that is going to have a lot of returns. So the social protection programs, regardless of whether children, women, and people living with disabilities are intended recipients, they should and they can respond to these vulnerabilities. That is when we start talking about mainstreaming, that's when we start talking about integration. So we should make sure there is a tailored kind of system that will address all the other back and forth interventions for children, for women, and people living with disabilities. The YLP and UWEP, as implemented from Ministry of Gender and the PWD grants and SAGE, we need to come out specifically on what we want to achieve after all this. What is our actual output? Because these would do a great deal in building resilience, so that even in the old age, those who are youths now, those who are women now, would not even be looking for anywhere for the 25,000 for SAGE. They should have built their resilience already with the youth livelihood support, with the women empowering entrepreneurship support, and the PWD grants. So we need to really think about this and make sure we make a system that will develop the YLP and the UWEP into a built system that will build resilience from shocks wherever they come. It's not about resources, it's about our priorities and the social accountability that the duty bearers have with the people or the citizens. So the other way is that we can organize and formalize the village savings and loans associations. These people are there, they are saving, and I'm sure the issue of the concept of social protection is in their plan. And so we can do financing as government. We provide them with safety, their money. We can provide them with capacity building on how to manage VSLAs so that they can support people with social protection. So in short, I would like to say we need concrete commitments, we need political feasibility, we need enabling environment, and the single registry for data as a means of every intervention. I thank you.
Thank you. On the budget question, really quickly, you uploaded them, and I know the budget is still being adjusted.
Yes.
But one of the things you've talked about is the siloed nature of this.
Yes,
so
right, yes.
One, we know we've gotten funds from IMF that are supposed to loans, or they're supposed to kind of go to social protection. World Bank, and the World Bank thing is kind of not very public, so maybe others here sort of know what it should entail. But we also see in the budget, we know that there's like 130 billion for public, labor-intensive public works. You know, they mention a few things here and there for other things. Do you have a sense of what the budget is for social protection as a percentage of what we're spending, you know, generally?
The budget on social protection,
and where it should.
The budget on social protection against the GDP is only 0.3%. And ideally, I think I would envision to see about the budget for social protection getting to 3%, because 0.03% is really so low. But even then, with that very low percentage to GDP, I think we would do something. If we only created synergies, if we brought all these packages together, and started knowing sure there is value for money, there is accountability, are right and appropriate. And of course, I would see a life cycle so that the system that is built, life system that will require government to base its policy design and program implementation on human rights principles, building a national legal and regulatory framework that acknowledges the right to social protection and a right to adequate standard of living. So the financing is low, but even that low finance, it is not clearly accounted for. And we have a number of social protection interventions, all of them being given some amounts of money, but we never come to see the results. And that is why everybody now comes up to cry, because there is no system. They are implemented just as projects. They're implemented as just programs, but not this kind of system where there is an inbuilt automatically they emerge. So we need to really have a bill now that we have a national social protection policy, which is also not yet funded and may be slow in implementation. But for us as Uganda Parliamentary Forum on Social Protection, we are looking at a bill which will become the legal framework that will sanction duty bearers to ensure that social protection is inbuilt in all sectors, that it becomes everybody's business. And therefore, instead of just agitating for financing, because these developing countries may not be able to raise all the funds, but we can be able to use the little funds that we have to use it as a system so that it can deliver to the people. It can also be there to catch and hold the people as they fall into vulnerability. So for us, we are looking at a system that will have a legal backing and that will sanction all duty bearers to ensure that if you are an employer, there is a social protection aspect for the workers. If you are anywhere employing any workers, informally or formally, the social protection aspect should cut across. And I would like to implore the Equal Opportunities Commission to take this up, because it is in their terms of reference. I want to see a robust Equal Opportunities Commission that really looks at inclusiveness, looks at equal opportunities, and make sure that the vulnerable are not left to the markets to determine their standards of living.
Okay.
And therefore, I with the Minister of Gender, but if the Minister of Gender becomes slow, I think we shall take the lead and take it as members here.
All right then, thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have lost your name for those remarks. I would like to,
Yes.
I don't see any other questions in the chat, so I do want to call all other panelists. I think they answered a number of the questions that had been put, which were really about how do we translate what is policy into practice for a lot of citizens and what demands can be. So I'm going to give an opportunity for everyone else to respond to the questions that were raised, give their thoughts and concluding remarks, because I know we are out of time. I'll start with Irene, and then Tanya, and then Lydia.
Thank you, Elena. My network's it's struggling a bit, so I won't switch on the video. But I think the conversation the trajectory has been fantastic, and Honorable Flavia has concluded it very well by just giving us very practical things that need to be done for Uganda. Overall, the entire discussion, what I would say from a systems point of view is that, yes, like, David had mentioned earlier, education is not necessarily part of social protection now. And the way that neoliberalism was that the very first things that went out were health and education. Those were cut out immediately. And so, even providing free meals for children at school, these things were really cut out. Those were the very first things that went. But over time now, it's about how do you take certain components of a welfare state, because no country is really working towards a welfare state anymore. But how do you take certain components around a welfare state and implement social protection within your context, within your country? So that's practical. What I do want to emphasize, and which has come very well both from Rebecca and Flavia's presentations, is the issue of focusing on social assistance versus social insurance. So when you look at what Lydia shared in terms of what the government's doing, and when you look at Uganda's focus, we focus a lot on social assistance, which means we are focusing on supporting the poor. The difference is that social, and Honorable Flavia gave a fantastic example where if you're contributing money, the citizens are contributing, so it's not necessarily relying on the government to get this money. Government's borrowing is accumulating a lot of debt over this social assistance. But if the government builds a system that is more focused on social insurance, it means that citizens are contributing themselves, and because they are contributing, it increases the resilience of the social protection, because that money can be invested and can accumulate. And so it's a better model for a country overall to focus on social insurance. Now, the question is then, how do you do that when you have where the social, NSSF is contributing, or the people who are benefiting from it, ideally are less than 1 million, if you're looking at contributions. Again, it comes back to how to create or to formalize a system. Now, formalizing doesn't necessarily mean that every person in the informal sector needs a contract, but it means that you create some sort of structure where every able-bodied person who is working is able to contribute to some sort of social protection system, both for themselves and for their families in the future, because everyone is going to get old. And, and as these shocks come in, everyone should be able to benefit equally. What you do have with a lot of demands coming in is that when you create a social insurance structure, people have a bit more autonomy in terms of what they can do with the support. Whereas when you focus on social assistance, the government determines. So the government will say, here is food, whereas there are people who would prefer that they get cash so they can reallocate it to what they think is most important. So I like the suggestions that came out, and I really liked what Rebecca said about the fact that, before COVID, as a country, but even as Africa generally, we'd never looked at emergency medical situations as social protection issues. So when we had the HIV/AIDS crisis in the 90s, and when we had Ebola, these were not discussed in the context of social protection. But now that it's become a global conversation, I think that there needs to be a complete rediscussion about how do you also include health and education within, the social protection mechanisms. Thank you.
Thank you for your concluding remarks. Although when you say focusing on social insurance rather than social assistance, then you think about the issues of vulnerable groups and who gets excluded with that model. I would like to hand over to Rebecca, and I keep interchangeably using your names. Sorry, so I should ask which one you prefer. But just to give us sort of your concluding thoughts, the responses to the questions that were asked earlier, and your concluding thoughts.
Thank you. I don't think I have any outstanding questions. I think I answered them. My thoughts as we conclude, maybe 3 or 4. One, I think social protection for the informal sector is important now more than ever. Now, we may not formalize the informal sector because you see the way the West or the developed world understands the informal sector is quite different from the way ours is structured. So first of all, can we begin by at least getting to where they are? Because as you reach them, then maybe you support them to have social protection there. Where, for example, in the markets, maybe for these other vendors, and then those small groups that are now coming together can then be sort of unionized, and then you can achieve a sort of formality without forcing it. But the moment you tell informal sector that you want to formalize them, then they think tax over taxation, you know, being arrested and all those things. So how can we do it without, you know, being too obvious or being worrisome to them? Secondly, the issue of collaboration across sectors is very important. I think all the speakers have alluded to it, but it's one of the things that can cut costs, as Honorable Flavia said. If for example, you're looking at, you know, delivering social protection in one area and you're working together, and maybe one group is, you know, one sector is looking at older persons and the other sector is looking at people with disabilities and the other sector is looking at women and children, but they are working together, then duplication will be, you know, removed, but also building an entire system of social protection and not, you know, going program-wise. I think that's very important. But then I'm worried about what seems to be coming about that government is over, you know, emphasizing social assistance as if it's maybe a bad thing or something. That it is not bad, because we shall always have people in Uganda who need social assistance, street children, old people. The proportion of the older persons who are not getting a government pension, what will you give them? Social assistance. And even us, for me at my age, when I grow old, very many people my age will not be members of NSSF, or they will not be getting a pension. So social assistance will always be important. But maybe how do we build around it to have other, you know, products? And finally, the question that probably hasn't been discussed but was alluded to, the synergies between decent work or employment policies and social protection. This is a question that actually needs to be discussed, maybe from the employment perspective, because people are losing jobs. So social protection wants to come in, but what is the role of the employment policy or the decent work policy? Maybe you will arrange another webinar to sort of elaborate on that. Thank you.
Glad you brought up the issue of minimum wage, which we've been advocating for as very much fundamental to social protection, and also I want to hand over to Lydia, who had a lot of criticism around what a lot of responses and some suggestions on how things should be done different. Recalling the first two questions I asked about whether the government is focusing a lot on social security versus social protection and the dangers in that. The need for a legal framework and sort of what you all are doing about it. And I think that's where we talk about the broader legal framework, but also issues like the minimum wage bill, where you at, and just any other responses, the questions that you feel to raise that you are best positioned to handle, and any other recommendations.
Thank you, Alana, and thank you, Honorable Flavia, Rebecca, for the presentations and responses. I'll start with the legal framework. We have the policy, and like I had earlier shared, I think it was a Twitter discussion. Of course, without a legislation making those demands and going to court and putting government to account and, you know, challenging that is not that easy. So we acknowledge the fact that we need a legal framework, but we had to do first things first. Remember, we have been implementing the senior citizens grant in a few districts. So we felt it wasn't strategic for you to begin saying we want this and show that this is what you demand, yet you are not everywhere. So we needed to first see that for a start, if we are going to say we have a legislation, at least we know that the program is everywhere, and then you can say now we need a legal framework to be able to sustain this and, you know, give it the position that it deserves. So we know it's something that we need to act on. And Honorable Flavia, I know, keeps saying this: if you don't do it, we are, as Parliamentary Forum, we are ready. And but it is something that we are conscious about. We know we need it. Even all the social protection discourse is clear that without a legislation, especially social assistance can't stand, because it will depend on what government can offer. And if it doesn't, you can't do anything much about it. Regarding the issue of focusing on social security, you know, your question is focusing on social security. Irene seems to believe that we are focusing on social assistance, and, you know, it's really a delicate balance. But if you have looked at the policy as I shared it, we really had a lot of thoughts about what we wanted to see in Uganda. That's why we looked at social security. Fortunately, both areas are in the area of social security from the social protection policy perspective. The contributory, which is now we are looking at as social assistance, we called it direct income support within the policy. It is still part of social security. The contributory, which is social security, it is still part of the social security. But to answer Alana's question, of course, you realize that discussing social security, people being able to access their money when there are pandemics, and assisting people that are vulnerable is clear. But the other aspect of social care is what is not clear. And I think that's where Alana is coming from. We thought about it very carefully, and we know that you cannot have resilience when people are there, they have disabilities, they can't be supported, they can't help themselves, no one is providing the care for them. Because we know that, especially for a person with disability, once you have given them the support that they need, you actually build their capacity to engage and even participate in productive activities. And that's what we really want to see. So we are still looking at developing that social care and support services system to ensure that we consolidate what is happening, but we also have clear deliverables. And we know that civil society has been good at this, just that they are in small packets. But if the system is well designed, we'll be able to address the needs of the people with disabilities, the children that need care, and the older persons that need care, as well as victims and survivors of gender-based violence. Regarding data, I think I talked about having the single registry fast-tracked, because I believe that once we have the data compiled, of course, we know that registry needs to be developed and finished. We are close to finishing it, but we know that it needs regular updates. So the commitment that once we have it, it is regularly updated. We already have challenges that different institutions have different means of collecting the data. Some of it rhymes with the national ID data, some of it doesn't. So having a unified system of data collection, that way we can know who is benefiting, who is left out, what more needs to be done to be able to provide comprehensive services. I think the question of education, you've answered it, but still again, like I said, we really looked critically and deliberately defined social protection to limit it, to leave education out. Otherwise, if we had gone to say, you know, school feeding is social, the government was going to tell us, you don't need a social protection policy. All these things we are doing. Health, we have the health policy, we have everything functioning. What are you talking about? That's why we went and said our niche is building resilience to shocks and vulnerabilities that everybody is exposed to. Everybody. And you know, many times people think social protection is about the poor. It is not, because COVID has showed us that people who had a job and were comfortable, I mean, people have been laid off. And yet if we had in place mechanism, if I'm saving, there's money coming, there's a system that can support us. If a job goes, there's a system that works. If I lose a leg, there's a system that supports me. That's really what we are looking at. And if everybody can rally behind implementing that social protection policy, I am confident that we will achieve much more for Uganda. And like Honorable Flavia said, investing in social protection is a very positive investment. $1 that you invest, you are able to get a multiplier of about $3. It's not wasting money, it is actually an investment, and an investment in human capital. I think I've answered most of the issues, and maybe as I conclude, I think there was an issue about the women in the markets. Rebecca answered a bit of it, but from an agenda perspective, of course, they were looking at determining, it wasn't even about a border being preferred to move and then a woman stays. It was about them not moving in and out. But if the market facilities were constructed in such a way that they were envisaging such situations, then there would be proper accommodation for the women in such situations. There would be adequate light, but you saw that the lighting wasn't even available. Of course, putting the women at risk of being sexually assaulted. And so all this had to be put into context. If the facilities are well constructed, with the facilities for child care centers, with good lighting, very good facilities for washing, even cleaning up, that was necessary. But you saw women going with the jerry cans to some toilet to wash up. So if we are looking at this, a comprehensive system, then even the construction of the markets should be able to address the needs of both women, their children, and those that are concerned. So I think as my final recommendation is to really support us. I know that silo implementation is a bigger challenge, but if as a government we can work together, we really have all actors involved within the policy. I didn't go into the detail, but I can share the policy. You see many government departments have a role to play. But vulnerable people are the responsibility of the Minister of Gender. They are not the responsibility of OPM. Because children, women, older persons, people with disabilities are all within the mandate of the Minister of Gender. So that's why social protection is the responsibility, and we are the lead agency in addressing and implementing the policy, coordinating with the others. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share. I will share, I think, with Leah the presentation so that she can share with the members here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. We have to go. I know some, like Irene has already rushed off, but a number of us still have to go. I hope we continue the conversation going. Please use the hashtag social protection in G. We've been having conversations about this for a couple of years now, but they've really come to the fore right now. So it will be great. Thank you again to Akina Mama for hosting a wonderful discussion and all these ideas. And we hope to the ministry that, again, we now have a sense of people you can consult and call on, particularly as you finalize things like the database and the criteria. I know we've worked on it a number of times with that, but some of the challenges being how do we bring different voices to raise issues we may not always see. But thank you again, and I would like to declare the webinar closed.
Yes. All right.
Bye. Maybe we'll just log out and say bye.
Thank you.